The candle on Charlotte's bedside table had burned low by the time Dominic arrived, and Thea heard him before she saw him. The particular weight of his step in the corridor, faster than usual, not quite running but close enough that she knew the message had reached him in the fields, and he had not stopped to change. He came through the door with mud still on his boots and his coat still buttoned against the evening cold, and he went directly to the bed without looking at Thea at all. He knelt beside Charlotte, took the child's small hand in both of his, and the look that crossed his face then was not the composed grief of a man practiced in loss. It was the naked terror of one who understood exactly how much could be taken. Thea had been managing the sick room for 6 hours. She had wrung cloths, measured doses, kept the fire steady, spoken to the physician, and done all of it with the quiet efficiency that the household had come to rely on in the 2 years since she had become its mistress. But watching Dominic kneel in the candlelight, with Charlotte's fever-damp hand pressed between his palms, Thea felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with temperature readings or broth. This is a story about what happens when a man tells the truth at the worst possible moment, and a woman hears only the wound she was already carrying. And a 5-year-old girl falls ill at precisely the hour when pretending becomes impossible. The fever had begun on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into October, with Charlotte complaining at supper that the candles were too bright. By Wednesday morning, the physician had been sent for, and by Wednesday evening, it was clear they were in for a long watch. The chest complaint settled into the small body with the stubborn patience of something that intended to stay, and the household arranged itself around the sick room with the silent coordination of people who understood the stakes. Thea had not slept properly in 36 hours by the time Dominic arrived on the first night. She had sent word to the North Fields at midday, not wanting to alarm him before the physician's second visit confirmed the severity. And so he came in the early evening with the evidence of the day's work still on him, and the kind of haste in his face that could not be managed into composure on short notice. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, still kneeling, his eyes on Charlotte. "Since this morning," Thea said. "Dr. Hartwell was here at noon and again at 4. He says the fever must break within 3 days, or he will want to try the new treatment from Edinburgh. The broth needs to go in every 2 hours. She will not take it willingly. You have to make it a game." Dominic nodded. He did not look up. His thumb moved in a slow circle on the back of Charlotte's hand, and Charlotte, half conscious, turned her face toward him with the wordless trust of a child who does not yet understand that the people she depends on are frightened. "Go and rest," Dominic said. "I will sit with her." "I will rest at 2, Thea said. "You take the hours from 2 until 5. Then I will come back." He looked up then, briefly, and something passed between them that was not quite gratitude and not quite argument. A recognition, rather, of the specific way they had learned to share the weight of this house and this child over 2 years of marriage. Then he looked back at Charlotte, and Thea settled into the chair on the opposite side of the bed. And the first night of the vigil began. They did not speak of anything except what was necessary. The temperature, taken every hour and recorded in Thea's careful hand on the paper the physician had left. The broth, which Charlotte took 3 spoonfuls of at midnight and refused entirely at 2 in the morning until Dominic told her it was dragon soup and that the dragon had specifically requested she drink it, at which point Charlotte drank half the cup with her eyes still closed. The physician's instruction about the window, cracked, not open, and never in a draft. These were the things they said to each other across Charlotte's small form, in the quiet voices of a sick room where neither person wanted to disturb what fragile rest the child could manage. The second night was harder. Charlotte's temperature climbed rather than falling, and by midnight she was calling for her mother. Not Thea, but the mother she had been too young to properly remember. The word rising out of the fever like something the illness had unlocked. Dominic sat rigid in his chair when it happened, and Thea crossed to the bed and gathered Charlotte against her without hesitation, pressing the child's burning face to her collarbone and saying, quietly and steadily, "I am here. I am right here." Charlotte's fingers clutched at Thea's nightgown and did not let go for the better part of an hour. Dominic did not speak. He sat in his chair on the other side of the bed and watched. And whatever he felt in that hour, he kept it entirely behind his face. On the third night, the fever began its slow retreat. By midnight, Charlotte's temperature had dropped by 2 degrees. By 3 in the morning, she was sleeping without the restless turning that had characterized the previous nights. Her breathing steadier, the flush at her cheeks fading from alarming to merely warm. At 4:30, Dr. Hartwell arrived for his dawn visit, checked Charlotte's temperature, listened to her chest, and told them both that the worst had passed. He left at 5. Charlotte slept, and the exhaustion that had been held back by necessity for 3 days descended on both of them simultaneously, stripping away everything that was not simply true. Thea sat with her hands in her lap, looking at Charlotte's sleeping face. The miniature portrait had been in her pocket for 3 weeks, found inside Dominic's watch case when she had taken it to be repaired after the mechanism failed, opened it to check the maker's mark, and found the small painted oval of Rosalind's face, looking back at her with the particular stillness of a woman who did not know she was being looked at. Thea had closed the case. She had said nothing. She had managed it the way she managed everything, by setting it aside and continuing to function, telling herself she would understand it when she had more information, telling herself it meant nothing definitive, telling herself she was not her mother. She took the miniature from her pocket now and set it on the bedside table, beside the water glass and the half-empty broth cup. Dominic looked at it. He did not look away. "When you kiss me, Dominic," Thea said. She kept her voice level. "Is it me you see?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. His answer came quietly, without cruelty. The word of a man who had decided, in the stripped-down truth of 5 o'clock in the morning after 3 nights without sleep, that he was done with the particular cowardice of omission. "No," he said. Thea nodded once. She reached up and wiped her lips slowly with the back of her hand, a gesture she was not entirely conscious of making, the body doing what the mind had not yet caught up to. Then she leaned forward and pressed 2 fingers to Charlotte's forehead one final time, checking the temperature out of habit or duty, or the need to do one last thing that was within her control. "Never again," she said. She stood. She walked out of the sick room and did not look back. She moved her belongings to the east wing that same morning, before the household was properly awake, carrying what she needed herself rather than calling for a maid. The east wing rooms were comfortable enough. She had overseen their refurbishment herself, the previous autumn, for reasons that had seemed purely practical at the time. She made the bed with the sheets she found in the linen press, set her writing case on the small desk by the window, and arranged her things with the methodical precision of a woman who understands that order is the only reliable comfort available at 5:30 in the morning. The household noticed. Households always do. But the accounts still needed settling, the tenants still needed receiving, Charlotte's meals still needed arranging, and Thea did all of it with the same competence she brought to everything, moving through the house like a woman who had simply decided to occupy less of it. The warmth drained out of every room she shared with Dominic, not through any dramatic announcement, but through the simple mathematics of what was no longer present. Dominic came to her door that afternoon. She heard him in the corridor before he knocked. That particular step again, slower now, without urgency. "Thea," he said, through the door. "I did not mean." She opened the door. She looked at him. "You meant every word," she said. "That is the problem. Go back to Charlotte. She needs someone with her when she wakes." She closed the door. She stood on her side of it and listened to him remain on his side of it for a long moment, his stillness as legible as speech, before his footsteps moved away down the corridor. The miniature had stayed on Charlotte's bedside table. Thea had not touched it again. 3 weeks earlier, when she had opened the watch case and found Rosalind's painted face, the particular stillness that had fallen over her was not the stillness of shock, but of recognition. The cold, specific recognition of a woman who has spent her entire life watching her mother be second. Her father's first wife, Eleanor, had died of a fever when Thea was 4 years old. Eleanor's portrait had hung in the gallery at Cavendish Park for 30 years, and her mother had smiled through 30 years of comparisons she had not invited and could not refuse. Thea had sworn, at some age too young to properly understand what she was swearing, that she would never occupy that position. She had believed, when she married Dominic, that she had chosen well enough to avoid it. She had managed the miniature with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. Set it aside, said nothing, waited for information. 3 weeks of waiting. And then Charlotte's fever had stripped the waiting away, and the truth had arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning with no warning and no softening. She was still managing it. She was managing it into the East Wing and out of their shared rooms, and through the household accounts with perfect accuracy. And she was managing it so well that she did not yet have space to notice what she had not thought to question. At breakfast, the morning after the fever broke, Charlotte sat between them at the table, pale and quieter than usual, but clearly on the mend, eating her toast with the focused attention of a child who has been ill and found hunger again. She looked from Thea's face to Dominic's face and back to Thea's, with the particular watchfulness of a 5-year-old who does not yet have words for what she is observing. "Mama," Charlotte said, "why are you not smiling at Papa?" Thea looked up from her teacup. "I am tired from the fever nights, darling. I expect I shall be tired for several days." Charlotte considered this. Then she turned to Dominic. "You should bring Mama flowers," she said. "You brought flowers when Cook was ill," and she smiled then, even when she was still poorly. Dominic looked at Charlotte with an expression that Thea did not examine. "That is very sound advice," he said. His voice was even. "Thank you." Charlotte nodded, satisfied, and returned to her toast. Thea drank her tea and said nothing at all. 4 days after the fever broke, Thea began removing Rosalind's watercolors from the morning room wall. There were 7 of them. Small, delicate studies of the estate grounds, painted during the years of the first marriage with a skill that was evident even to someone who had not known the painter. Thea had left them in place for 2 years, understanding that they were Charlotte's inheritance as much as anything else in the house, telling herself that the morning room was large enough for both wives' tastes. She began taking them down now with the same methodical precision she had applied to moving her belongings, stacking them carefully against the wall with tissue between each one to protect the surfaces. Mrs. Anstey found her there 20 minutes into the task. The housekeeper was 57, had served the household through both marriages, and had the particular quality of long-tenured domestic staff who have seen enough to know what not to say, and enough to know when not saying it becomes its own failure. She watched Thea lift the fourth watercolor from its hook. Then she spoke. "My lady," Mrs. Anstey said, "before you take those down, I want to tell you something, if I may." Thea did not stop. "Go ahead, Mrs. Anstey." "His Grace has never once asked me how the accident happened," Mrs. Anstey said. "In 5 years of service since Lady Rosalind died. Not me, not Mr. Cope, not the groom who was first on the scene, not Dr. Hartwell who attended afterward. He decided he was guilty the day it happened, and he closed the question before anyone could tell him otherwise." Thea went still. She was holding the fourth watercolor with both hands, and she held it without moving for the space of several seconds. "He never asked," she said. "Not once, my lady. In 5 years." Thea looked at the watercolor in her hands, a study of the north path in spring, the old oak visible at the bend, the light coming through the leaves in the way that painters find, and the rest of the world walks past without noticing. She did not put it back on the wall, but she set it down on the side table rather than adding it to the stack against the wall, and she stood looking at it for a moment before she moved to the fifth hook. She did not say anything else to Mrs. Anstey, but the certainty she had carried out of the sick room, the clean, architectural certainty of a woman who believes she has understood exactly what she has been told, developed its first fracture in that morning room, and the fracture was not about her own wound. It was about his. That afternoon, without quite deciding to, Thea walked to the stable. She went past the working stalls, past the horses that were exercised daily and knew her footstep, and she stopped at the stall at the far end, the one that housed Artemis, the gray mare that Dominic had given Rosalind 7 years ago, and that had not been ridden in 5 years. Artemis was in good condition, well-fed and well-groomed, the best-kept animal in the stable for reasons that had nothing to do with usefulness and everything to do with guilt. The horse looked at Thea over the stall door with the mild, uncomplicated gaze of an animal that does not understand why it has become a monument. Thea stood at the stall door for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to the house. The following morning she returned to the stable and asked to speak with Mr. Cope. The stable master was 60 years old, built with the particular density of a man who had spent his life working with large animals, and he had served the estate since before Dominic's father had been the Duke. He met Thea in the yard, with the courtesy that long service and genuine respect produce, and he waited for her to speak first. "Mr. Cope," Thea said, "I want to ask you a specific question about the accident. When was the girth strap on Artemis's saddle last replaced before Lady Rosalind's fall?" Cope did not hesitate. He had, it seemed, been waiting for this question for some time. "Never, my lady," he said. "I requested it twice, once in the spring of that year and once in the autumn before. The old Duke refused both times. He said the leather was sound enough." Thea looked at him. "And was it?" "I checked it the morning of the accident," Cope said. "I checked it because I was not easy in my mind about it. The leather was worn through at the point where it bore the most stress. I should have refused to saddle the horse. I have thought about that every day since." He paused. "The cost of a replacement girth was 3 shillings, my lady. 3 shillings. Thea stood in the stable yard with the October air moving around her and Artemis nosing at her sleeve through the open top of the stall door, and she held the fact. The leather had failed. The old Duke's negligence, his refusal of a 3-shilling expenditure, had killed Rosalind. Not the horse Dominic had given her, not the path Dominic had suggested. A piece of worn leather that the stable master had flagged twice and the old Duke had dismissed twice, because 3 shillings was apparently more than the life of his future daughter-in-law was worth. Dominic had never asked, not in 5 years. She thanked Cope and walked back to the house. She held the fact carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure how to carry. That afternoon, Lady Bridwell arrived. She was 48, Rosalind's closest friend since girlhood. And she had visited the estate twice since Thea's marriage, with the particular warmth of a woman who has decided to extend genuine goodwill rather than performative tolerance. She took tea in the drawing room, and after the usual exchanges about Charlotte's recovery and the county news, she set down her cup and looked at Thea directly. "I know something is wrong," Lady Bridwell said. "I am not going to pretend otherwise, because I think you are too sensible a woman to want me to. I am going to say one thing, and then I will leave it entirely with you." "Go ahead," Thea said. "Rosalind would have disliked this very much," Lady Bridwell said. "Being used as a haunting, I mean. She was not a woman who wanted to outlast her own life in other people's marriages. She was entirely too alive for that kind of thing." Lady Bridwell paused. "And she would have chosen you herself, for Charlotte. I want you to know that. She talked about the kind of woman she would want for her daughter if something happened to her. You are exactly what she described." Thea was quiet for a moment. "That does not make what he said less true," she said at last. "No," Lady Bridwell agreed. "It does not. But it makes what he meant considerably more complicated than what you heard." Thea did not answer. She poured more tea and held the cup with both hands and did not answer. And Lady Bridwell, to her credit, did not press the point. After Lady Bridwell left, Thea sat alone in the drawing room and held two things separately: the girth strap and what he meant. She could see that they were connected. She could not yet see exactly how. She went to the library that evening and sat alone with the miniature in her hand. She had taken it from Charlotte's bedside table that morning, telling herself she would return it, not yet certain why she had taken it at all. She looked at Rosalind's painted face for a long time. The portrait was small enough to fit in a watch case, which meant it had been commissioned for concealment rather than display, which meant something she had not previously considered. She knew now that the accident was not Dominic's fault. The leather, the old Duke's refusal, the 3 shillings, these were facts. And facts, once known, could not be unknown. But she could not yet account for why a man who was clearly capable of investigation, who investigated everything from tenant disputes to drainage problems with methodical thoroughness, had never once applied that capacity to the worst day of his life. Not in 5 years. Not a single question to Cope, to Mrs. Anstey, to the groom, to the physician. She placed the miniature on the library desk and went to find Dominic. He was at his writing table, going through correspondence with the focused inattention of a man who is performing the act of working rather than actually working. He looked up when Thea came in. She crossed to the desk and set the miniature down in front of him. "This belongs to Charlotte," she said, "not your watch case." He looked at it. Then he reached for it. Thea had not moved her hand quickly enough, and for 5 seconds their fingers rested on the same small oval of painted ivory, over Rosalind's face, neither of them speaking. Then Thea released first and stepped back and left the room. That evening, Charlotte refused most of her supper. She asked, when Thea came to say goodnight, whether she could sleep in Thea's room. Thea said yes, and settled the child in the east wing bed and sat with her until she slept. Charlotte's fingers curled around Thea's wrist with the grip of a child who is not quite sure what she is holding on to. The next morning, Charlotte pressed herself against Thea's side at the breakfast table and kept one hand on Thea's arm throughout the meal, as though physical contact were a form of reassurance she needed to continuously renew. Dominic watched from across the table. He said nothing. Mrs. Anstey found Thea in the corridor afterward. "She knows something is broken between you," Mrs. Anstey said quietly. "Children always know. They cannot say what they know, but they feel it everywhere." Thea looked at Charlotte, who was standing at the morning room door, waiting for her. Small and still in a way that 5-year-olds are not meant to be still. She understood then that her withdrawal was not costing only the husband. It was costing the child who had already lost one mother, and who was now watching the architecture of her security develop cracks she had no language for. Thea went to Dominic's study that afternoon and closed the door behind her. "I spoke with Mr. Cope yesterday morning," she said. "I asked him one question. When was the girth strap on Artemis's saddle last replaced before the accident?" She waited. "He told me it had never been replaced. He had requested it twice. Your father refused both times. The leather was worn through. He checked it himself the morning of the accident. 3 shillings, Dominic. The old Duke refused 3 shillings. And that is why Rosalind fell." Dominic had gone very still. "She fell from the horse I gave her," he said. "She fell because the girth failed," Thea said. "The horse was sound. You gave her a sound horse. Did you ever ask Cope what happened? Did you ask the groom? Did you ask anyone, at any point in 5 years, how she actually fell?" "I know how she fell," Dominic said. "You know that she fell," Thea said. "That is not the same thing. You decided what happened before anyone could tell you otherwise. Mrs. Anstey said it, and she is right. You gave Rosalind the horse and suggested the path and decided that made you responsible. And you sealed that decision shut so thoroughly that the actual cause of the accident was sitting in Cope's memory for 5 years, waiting for a question you never asked." She stopped. She made herself slow down. "I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it because Charlotte has stopped eating properly. She asked to sleep in my room last night. She will not let go of my hand at breakfast. I cannot keep punishing you at her expense, Dominic. We need to finish this." "You do not understand what it was like," he said. "Then explain it to me," Thea said. "Because what I understand at this moment is that you told me at 5 o'clock in the morning, after 3 days of being terrified for Charlotte, that you thought of Rosalind every time you kissed me. And I heard that as a verdict on our marriage. I heard it as my mother's story, 30 years of being compared to Eleanor, 30 years of being second. I am not certain that is what you meant. But you are going to have to tell me what you meant, because I cannot work it out on my own, and Charlotte is suffering while I try." Dominic opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his desk, at the surface of it, at nothing in particular. "She cannot keep suffering while you find the words," Thea said. "Come to her room tonight. Read to her. She needs both of us." She left him there. That evening, Thea sat on Charlotte's bed and read aloud The Wolf Story, which Charlotte had requested every night for 3 weeks, and which Thea had memorized to the point where she could deliver it with the full cast of voices Charlotte required. The deep grumble of the wolf, the quick, bright voice of the girl, the slow rumble of the grandmother. Charlotte was laughing by the second page, propped against her pillow with color back in her cheeks and her hands folded in her lap. And the laughter was the first genuinely uncomplicated sound Thea had heard in days. Dominic appeared in the doorway midway through the 3rd chapter. Charlotte saw him immediately. "Papa," Charlotte said. "Sit him, there's room." He sat on the other side of the bed. Charlotte reached for his hand without interrupting the story, and Thea kept reading. And by the time the wolf had been comprehensively outwitted and the grandmother restored and the final page turned, Charlotte's eyes were heavy and her breathing had slowed to the deep rhythm of genuine sleep. She was still holding one of Thea's hands and one of Dominic's. They sat like that for 20 minutes. Neither of them moved, because Charlotte's grip was light enough that movement would have woken her. And neither of them was willing to be the one who broke the child's sleep for the sake of their own discomfort. The candle on the bedside table burned steadily. Outside the window, the night was clear and cold and entirely indifferent to the difficulty of the situation. Thea looked up. Dominic was already looking at her. She held his gaze across Charlotte's sleeping face, and she shaped the words without sound. "We need to finish this." He nodded. His face, in the candlelight, was the face of a man who has run out of ways to avoid something, and has arrived, exhausted, at the necessity of it. The next morning, Thea walked the North Estate path alone. She went early, before the household was fully active, in the gray October light that made the grounds look like a painting of themselves. The path wound north from the stable yard through the pasture land and into the older part of the estate, where the trees were larger and the ground softer. And she walked it all the way to the bend where the old oak stood, the tree that appeared in Rosalind's watercolor, in the morning room, in the stack against the wall. She stood at the bend and looked at the ground, the specific depression in the track where the soil was soft, and the distance from the house was such that a fall here would have meant long minutes before anyone came. She stood there for a while. She did not perform any emotion about it. She simply looked because she had decided she needed to see it without him before she could ask him to see it with her. Then she walked back to the house. A groom in the stable yard told her his grace had gone out toward the north fields. Thea nodded and went inside and waited. She was standing at the stable entrance when Dominic returned an hour later, and she saw from the way he came around the corner of the yard that he had not been to the north fields at all, or not only there. "I have walked the path," she said when he was close enough. "The full length of it. I went alone first because I needed to see it without you." She met his eyes. "Meet me there." He was at the bend before she arrived. He was standing with his back to the old oak, looking at the depression in the track, and he did not turn when he heard her footsteps on the path. He turned when she stopped beside him, and his face was entirely without the careful composure he usually maintained. Not collapsed exactly, but stripped of the architecture he normally kept in place. Thea stood in front of him, with the October sky above the oak and the soft ground of the track between them, and she told him what she now understood. "You gave Rosalind a sound horse," she said. "You suggested a path you had ridden yourself 100 times. The leather on the girth was worn through because your father refused to spend 3 shillings on a replacement, despite the fact that Mr. Cope requested it twice and told him directly it needed doing. The accident was your father's negligence. It was never yours." Dominic said nothing. "You chose guilt," Thea said. "Not because it was true, but because it was available. You were here. You were the one who gave her the horse and suggested the path. And guilt is a very efficient explanation for something that makes no sense. It closes the question before anyone has to sit with the actual answer, which is that sometimes people die for reasons that are no one's fault except the person who refused to spend 3 shillings. She stopped. "You never asked Cope what happened. Not in 5 years. And I think you know why." "Because she was dead," Dominic said. His voice had the quality of something speaking from a long distance away. "Because it did not matter how." "It mattered enormously how," Thea said. "But knowing would have taken the guilt away. And without the guilt, you would have had to be happy. And being happy felt like a betrayal of her. He turned away. He looked at the depression in the track. "I gave her the horse," he said. "You gave her a horse," Thea said. "The leather failed. Those are two different sentences, and I need you to hear the difference." He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, and without the evasiveness that she had come to recognize as his defense. "Every time Charlotte laughed," he said. "Every time the house felt like a house again instead of a place where something had happened. Every time I kissed you." He stopped. "It felt like I was getting away with something, like I was taking something I had not earned. And then the guilt would arrive, and it was easier than the happiness. The happiness required me to believe I deserved it. And the guilt told you that you did not," Thea said. "Yes," he said. "So Rosalind was not a comparison," Thea said. "She was a verdict. Every time you thought of her in the middle of a moment with me, it was not because you loved her more. It was because the guilt was reminding you that you did not deserve to love anyone at all." He turned back to face her. Something in his face had come apart and not yet reassembled. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly it." Thea looked at him. She held what she knew now against what she had believed for the past 2 weeks, and she made herself be accurate. "I heard your confession as my mother's story," she said. "I heard second wife, and I heard the portrait in the gallery, and I heard 30 years of my mother smiling through comparisons she had not invited. I brought that wound into this marriage, and I never told you about it, because telling you would have meant demanding something. And I was too busy being useful to demand anything." She took a breath. "I managed your grief like I managed the accounts. I thought if I was competent enough and warm enough and patient enough, eventually the grief would become something smaller. I never asked you what it actually was. I never required you to look at it directly. That was my failure. Not because I was weak, but because demanding the truth would have felt like making a claim on you. And I was not sure I was entitled to claims." Dominic was watching her with the focused attention of a man hearing something he had not expected to hear. "My mother managed my father's devotion to Eleanor for 30 years through usefulness," Thea said. "I was doing the same thing. And then you told me the truth at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I heard only what I was already afraid of." She paused. "Both things are true. Your guilt was built on a false foundation, and my absolutism was inherited from my mother's wound. We have both been wrong. The question is whether we can fix it." "How?" he said. "You go to Cope," Thea said. "You sit down with him in Artemis's stall, and you ask him to tell you everything. Not what you decided. Not the story you have been carrying for 5 years, but what actually happened. You listen to the whole of it. And then you come back to our bedroom. Not the East Wing, our bedroom. And you tell me one true thing about the two of us that has nothing to do with Rosalind." He looked at her. The October wind moved through the oak above them, and a few leaves came down and settled on the soft ground of the track. "One thing," he said. "One thing," Thea said. "We can start with one." She held out her hand. He took it, the first time they had touched in 2 weeks, and she felt the warmth of his hand against her palm, like something she had been cold without and not admitted. They stood at the bend in the north path for another moment. Then Thea released his hand and turned back toward the house. And after a moment, she heard his footsteps following. Dominic found Cope in Artemis's stall that afternoon, cleaning the gray mare's feet with the unhurried competence of a man who does not rush work that requires patience. He asked Cope if he had a few minutes. Cope set down the hoof pick and said he had as long as was needed. He told Dominic everything. The first request for the girth replacement, made in the spring, and the old Duke's dismissal of it. The second request, in the autumn, and the second refusal. The morning of the accident, when Cope had checked the leather himself and found it worn through to the point where he had nearly refused to saddle the horse. And then had not refused, because the old Duke was standing in the yard and Cope had been afraid of him in the particular way that long service under a difficult man produces. I checked it again after, Cope said. After they brought Lady Rosalind back. The strap had failed at exactly the point I had been worried about. If I had refused to saddle the horse that morning, she would have been alive. He paused. I have carried that for 5 years, Your Grace. But the man who made the decision that killed her was your father, not you. Dominic sat in Artemis's stall with the mare's nose resting on his shoulder and listened to all of it without speaking. When Cope finished, the room held its quiet for a long moment before Dominic spoke. I should have asked you this 5 years ago, Dominic said. Yes, Cope said. But I expect you were not ready to hear it. Dominic sat there after Cope left, in the clean straw smell of the stall, with Artemis shifting her weight beside him in the uncomplicated way of horses. And he let the 5 years of it rearrange themselves around the facts he'd just been given. The leather had failed. His father's negligence, his father's 3-shilling refusal, his father's particular brand of carelessness with the things that belonged to other people. Not the horse he had given Rosalind, not the path he had suggested, a piece of worn leather, and a man who could not be bothered to replace it. He was blameless. The knowledge sat in him strangely, not like relief, not yet, but like a weight he had been carrying so long that its absence felt like a different kind of heaviness, the heaviness of all the years it had occupied. He got up. He walked to the house, not to the east wing, to their bedroom. Thea was standing at the window when he came in, looking out at the grounds in the last of the afternoon light. She turned when she heard the door. He had prepared, on the walk from the stable, a single true thing. He had been going to say, I married you because the house stopped being silent. But standing in the doorway looking at her, he found that one thing was insufficient for the size of what he actually wanted to say, and that the inadequacy of it was suddenly very funny to him in a way he had not expected. 3 things, he said. I know you asked for one. Charlotte's wolf voice, the way she does the growl with her whole body, not just her throat. The argument with Harding about the drainage last March, when you had clearly read more on the subject than he had, and you let him figure that out himself rather than telling him. And the way you hold your teacup with both hands when you are cold, even though you are not supposed to, because it is not considered elegant. Thea looked at him. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite tears and was entirely itself. I asked for one, she said. You have always been excessive in your requirements, he said. I was simply being accurate. She crossed the room. She took his face in her hands, both hands, the way she held the teacup. And she looked at him directly, close enough that there was no possibility of looking at anything else. Stop rehearsing, she said, and do it properly. He kissed her with his eyes open. She kept hers open. There was no ghost in the room. There was only the particular quality of late October light through the bedroom window, and the warmth of her hands on his face, and the specific, irreplaceable fact of this woman, who had investigated what he had refused to investigate, and demanded what he had refused to offer, and was still here. The miniature moved to Charlotte's bedside table that evening. Thea carried it there herself, and set it beside the water glass and the lamp. And when Charlotte asked what it was, Thea told her it was a portrait of her mother, and that it had been kept in a watch case for too long. She was very beautiful, Charlotte said, looking at it. She was, Thea said. You should be able to see her face. It should not be kept hidden. Charlotte nodded with the gravity of a 5-year-old who understands that some things are simply right. Then she reached for Thea's hand and held it until she fell asleep. In autumn, the north path was bright with the particular gold of October, and Charlotte ran ahead of them, collecting conkers with the focused intensity of a child who has found a purpose equal to her energy. She had been running ahead for 20 minutes by the time they reached the bend, her voice carrying back to them in fragments. This one, Mama, look at this one. And the old oak was exactly as it had always been, indifferent and enormous and entirely without drama. Dominic took Thea's hand as they walked through the bend. He did not slow, he did not stop. He took her hand, and they walked through the place together, and the ground was simply ground, and the path continued. And ahead of them, Charlotte held up a conker the size of a small fist and announced that it was the biggest one in the county, and possibly the world. Thea laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere uncalculated, and went forward to look at the conker with the seriousness it deserved. In the stable, Artemis had a new girth. Thea had ordered it the week before and had told Cope that it was to be replaced annually going forward on the 1st of October, without waiting to be asked. Cope had looked at her for a moment and then nodded, and the matter was settled in the way that all the best matters were settled, practically, permanently, and without ceremony. The miniature portrait sat on Charlotte's bedside table where Thea had placed it, Rosalind's painted face turned toward the room rather than concealed inside a case. A girl should be able to see her mother's face. That was simply true, and true things, once named, did not require defending. Charlotte ran back to them on the path, one hand full of conkers and her cheeks red from the cold, and she pushed the largest one into Dominic's hand and told him to carry it because she needed both hands for the rest. He pocketed it without argument. Charlotte ran ahead again. Thea walked beside Dominic in the October light, her hand in his, and they passed the old oak and the soft ground at the bend and the specific place where the path curved north, and none of it required anything of them except to keep walking. The north path was a path. Charlotte was ahead on it. The house was behind them, warm and lit and occupied by people who had decided to remain in it. They kept walking.